The day he called me intimidating was the day I realized exactly how fragile his empire really was. On the surface, he was the picture of confidence, a polished suit, a perfectly styled office, a voice that commanded attention. But underneath it all, he was a man terrified of being exposed. And I had already seen the cracks. I had joined his company 6 months earlier, eager to prove myself as a strategist, someone who could streamline operations, fix inefficiencies, and bring order to chaos. What I hadn't expected was how quickly I would uncover the chaos he was hiding: the inflated reports, the careless contracts, the quietly ignored compliance warnings. Every day I watched him maneuver through his empire like a man juggling fragile glass. Pretending nothing would shatter, I made it my mission to observe quietly, asking pointed questions in meetings that made him squirm. He hated that. Every time I spoke, I could see it in his eyes, panic masked as irritation. "You're intimidating," he finally said one afternoon, leaning back in his leather chair, a smirk plastered across his face. It wasn't a compliment. It was a warning. But to me, it was confirmation. I was right. He feared me. And fear, I had learned, was a far more revealing emotion than arrogance. For weeks, I stayed in the shadows, letting him show his true colors. I smiled, nodded, and quietly recorded everything: numbers, emails, contracts, mismanaged accounts, whispers of boardroom discontent. Every careless decision he made, every arrogant dismissal of warnings was another piece of evidence. Every moment, he unknowingly painted a perfect blueprint of how to bring the company to its knees. The more he tried to assert control, the more reckless he became. He flaunted deals that were more smoke than substance, boasted about partnerships that barely existed, and ignored compliance notices as if they were minor inconveniences. And all the while, he continued to underestimate me, believing that his title and reputation could intimidate me into silence. But I wasn't here to be intimidated. I was here to watch, to learn, to wait. And when I finally left, when I walked out of his office for the last time, I carried with me more than my resignation letter. I carried a record of every secret, every flaw, every vulnerability he thought he had buried. And I knew, even as I closed the door behind me, that this was just the beginning. The empire he had spent years building was about to collapse. He thought calling me intimidating was a threat. I knew it was a promise. From the moment I stepped into his office, I knew this company was built on perception, not reality. Everyone around him acted like he was untouchable, executives nodding, employees tiptoeing, investors dazzled by his charm, but I could see behind the curtain. Numbers that didn't add up, deals that were barely signed, promises to clients that were already broken. It was a house of cards, and he thought it was concrete. At first, I kept my head down. I learned the rhythms of the office, studied his patterns, noticed how he reacted under pressure. He had an instinct for spotting weakness, but only weakness that was obvious. Strength, that was terrifying to him. So I cultivated it quietly. I asked the right questions in meetings, questions that seemed innocent, but were designed to expose cracks. How are we mitigating this risk? Have we double-checked these contracts? What about compliance on this deal? Every question made him flinch, just a little. And I stored those moments like evidence. He began to label me in whispers to his inner circle. Intimidating. Dangerous, someone we have to manage carefully. To the others, I seemed confident but polite. To him, I was a threat. And the more he tried to contain me, the more reckless he became. I watched him cut corners on big deals, promise deliverables he couldn't fulfill, and ignore red flags that any competent executive would have addressed immediately. Every misstep was a thread I could pull, and he didn't even realize it. The employees around me whispered too. They noticed how he treated me differently, how he tried to subtly discredit me in meetings, how he overruled my ideas in front of others, how he questioned my loyalty without ever saying why. They were afraid, yes, but they were also starting to watch me. I realized that my presence was shaking the entire culture of the company. Fear was contagious, but so was competence. And I had both. Behind closed doors, I began compiling evidence. Emails, spreadsheets, contracts, financial statements. I documented every discrepancy, every moment where his arrogance overrode judgment. Every deal he mishandled, every client complaint he ignored, every compliance issue that slipped through the cracks, it all went into a carefully organized file. I didn't need to confront him yet. I just needed the proof because one day, I would have the power to show the world exactly what this invincible CEO had been hiding. Meanwhile, the cracks in the company were widening faster than anyone realized. Investors were whispering, departments were faltering, and partners were losing trust. He blamed the market, blamed the employees, even blamed me at times, but never himself. And that overconfidence, that refusal to see reality was the same thing that would make him implode. I could feel it coming, like the quiet hum before a storm. And so I waited. I stayed, observed, and carefully built my arsenal. Every move he made, every slip-up he took for granted, I recorded. Every interaction, every meeting, every flawed decision, I kept it all. He didn't see me as a strategist. He saw me as a threat. And the irony was delicious. The more he underestimated me, the faster his empire was unraveling. By the time I finally handed in my resignation, I didn't just walk away from a job. I walked away with a blueprint for his downfall. A single file, meticulously organized, held the potential to expose years of mismanagement, hubris, and negligence. And as I left the office that last day, I knew one thing for certain. The CEO who had called me intimidating had no idea that his own arrogance had just sealed his fate. By the time I handed in my resignation, the office was already buzzing with tension. The employees had noticed the cracks, even if they didn't fully understand them yet. Deals were slipping through the cracks, departments were misaligned, and rumors were spreading faster than the CEO could control. I watched from my desk as he tried to keep a calm facade, but the tremor in his confidence was unmistakable. The first real sign of trouble came during a board meeting. Investors were asking pointed questions, probing deeper than usual, demanding explanations for inconsistencies in financial reports. He smiled, waved them off, but his hands were shaking slightly. And I caught that look, the one that said, "I'm out of control and everyone can see it." I stayed quiet, watching carefully, letting the storm grow. Meanwhile, the employees who had once feared me were now cautiously turning toward me. Whispers of, "She's always right," reached my ears. They were scared, yes, but they were beginning to see the truth. His intimidation no longer worked, not with me, not with the subtle rebellion brewing around me. Every time he barked orders or tried to assert control, it only exposed him further. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Clients were starting to question deadlines. Vendors were calling with complaints. Small cracks in the structure of the company were now spreading like veins of ice through the heart of the business. And every time he tried to blame someone else, every time he tried to maintain the illusion of control, he only sank deeper. What made it worse for him was that I had left quietly, without a scene, without confrontation. He had no idea what I was taking with me. No one suspected that a meticulously organized record of every misstep, every corner cut, every financial and operational flaw had left the building with me in a single folder. That file, innocuous in appearance, contained everything, proof that his empire was built on smoke, mirrors, and negligence. And now he was losing control. The first whispers of panic began circulating among the investors. Questions that had previously been brushed aside were now coming back louder, sharper, and with more urgency. Departments were pointing fingers. Partners were growing wary. And the CEO, the man who once called me intimidating, was too proud to admit he had no plan, no defense, and no idea how fragile everything had become. I didn't have to act yet. All I had to do was wait. The pieces were moving themselves. His arrogance was unraveling him from within. And with every faltering presentation, every confused board member, every missed deadline, the inevitability of collapse crept closer. I smiled quietly to myself. The storm was building, and he had no idea it had my fingerprints all over it. He never saw it coming. The betrayal didn't come from me, not directly, but from the very empire he thought he controlled. Every corner he had cut, every shortcut he had taken, every client he had reassured with empty promises was about to rise up and expose him. And he had no idea how exposed he truly was, within days of my departure. The cracks I had quietly observed for months began to turn into chasms. The investors I had overheard murmuring in boardrooms suddenly demanded audits, questioning reports that had previously gone unquestioned. Contracts I had flagged as risky were now blowing up in his face, obligations he hadn't honored, clauses he had ignored, promises he had failed to keep. Partners were angry, suppliers were threatening to walk, and key clients were reconsidering their agreements. It was as though the company itself was turning against him. He tried to fight back. He sent urgent emails, held emergency meetings, and called in consultants to fix what he insisted were minor issues. But his panic made him reckless. Decisions that once took careful consideration were now made hastily, without strategy, without foresight. Every move he made only amplified the chaos, and the employees, those same people who once trembled at his voice, began to talk more openly. Rumors spread faster than ever, and the whispers of "she was right" were everywhere. No one was loyal to him because he had never been loyal to anyone. His authority, which had seemed absolute, was now hollow. And every glance in the office carried the unspoken question: if she was right, how much more is wrong? Meanwhile, I had no contact with the company. I didn't need to. All I had to do was wait. Every email I had archived, every document I had secured, every discrepancy I had noted quietly during my tenure was now like a ticking time bomb. The pieces were falling into place, and the world around him was beginning to see the empire for what it really was: fragile, flawed, and built on arrogance. The betrayal, in the truest sense, was how little control he actually had.
He thought the problem was me, the intimidating strategist who had dared question him.
But the real betrayal came from the truth itself, the evidence of mismanagement, negligence, and pride that he had ignored for so long. And as that truth slowly surfaced, there was nothing he could do to stop it. He called emergency meetings, pleading with the board, promising immediate corrections. But no one believed him anymore. He tried to salvage partnerships, to calm clients, to patch over the gaps, but each attempt only revealed another flaw, another corner cut, another promise broken. The walls were closing in, and his empire, which had seemed untouchable, was crumbling under the weight of his own missteps. And I watched from the sidelines, a silent observer to the unraveling. The man who had once labeled me intimidating now faced the ultimate irony. It wasn't me who betrayed him, it was the empire he had built. The arrogance he had flaunted and the blind hubris that had led him to believe he was untouchable. In the end, the betrayal wasn't personal, it was poetic. And when the first public reports began to surface, when the first clients backed out, when the board called an emergency session to discuss the company's future, he finally understood the magnitude of what he had lost. He had underestimated the power of truth and the consequences of ignoring it. I hadn't planned on revenge when I walked out of his office for the last time. I just wanted distance from the mess he was creating. But watching the chaos unfold from afar, watching him scramble, watching the board grow suspicious, watching the cracks widen until they were too big to hide, it made one thing clear: the truth was finally ready to be revealed. And I was the only one who could reveal it cleanly, legally, and without ever stepping foot back into the company, he thought. He ruled. My plan was simple, precise, surgical. I began by organizing the files. I had collected contracts with hidden liabilities, compliance warnings he had ignored, emails where he overrode legal advice, financial documents full of discrepancies he hoped no one would ever notice. I didn't need to twist anything. I didn't need to embellish. The truth was already devastating. All I had to do was arrange it so it spoke clearly, loudly, and undeniably. I anonymized my documents, removing my name, my involvement, my fingerprints. This wasn't about credit or attention. This was about accountability. I prepared a complete, chronological report, a quiet masterpiece of facts and evidence, detailing how his mismanagement and ego had put the company, the employees, and the investors at risk. Every decision, every oversight, every lie he had sold as strategy was laid out with perfect clarity. Then, I sent it. Not to the CEO, he didn't deserve a warning. Not to the employees, they had suffered enough. Not even to the board directly, I sent it to the company's external auditors. a group he couldn't, charm. A team he couldn't intimidate. An entity legally bound to report the truth within 24 hours. The quiet hum beneath the company turned into a roar. An unannounced audit was ordered. The board demanded immediate access to financials. Departments froze. Meetings were canceled. And the CEO, so confident, so dismissive, so certain of his own brilliance, was suddenly surrounded by people who no longer trusted a single word he said. I watched everything unfold from a distance, sipping coffee in the quiet calm of my new office at my new job. Every hour brought a new update, anonymous messages from former coworkers, whispers of panic, hints of desperate board calls. He tried to blame everyone but himself, finance, legal, operations, even the market. But the report was too detailed, too precise, too organized for anyone to deny. It painted a perfect picture of one man's negligence. He knew someone had exposed him. He just didn't know it. Was the woman he once tried to belittle, the one he called intimidating? I didn't need to say a word. He was surrounded by the consequences of his own actions. Drowning in the evidence he had created. Himself. His empire wasn't collapsing because of me. It was collapsing because I finally let the truth breathe. And the truth was always stronger than his ego. The storm hit harder than anyone expected. Within hours of the auditors receiving my report, the company transformed from a buzzing empire into a cage of panic. Every email I had meticulously documented, every contract I had flagged, every corner he had cut without consequence suddenly became evidence he could no longer ignore or control. The board convened an emergency meeting, tension so thick it felt physical. He sat at the head of the table, shoulders stiff, eyes darting like a hunted animal. Around him, senior executives whispered, casting uneasy glances in my direction, though no one knew I was behind the report. The whispers weren't about me, they were about him. How could we have missed this? Why weren't these issues caught earlier? Did he know what he was doing? He tried to speak first, tried to charm, tried to justify, tried to assert dominance. But the documents had already done their work. One by one, the auditors presented their findings, everything from mismanaged funds, unexplained liabilities, missed compliance deadlines to falsified reports. Each slide, each summary, each chart stripped him bare. His confident facade crumbled. Words faltered. Fingers shook. Every denial, every excuse fell flat against the mountain of undeniable truth. Executives he had once ruled with fear began quietly questioning him in front of the board. These figures don't match what we were told. Contracts here show liabilities not accounted for. The client complaints, they're escalating. His eyes flickered nervously across the room, searching for allies. There were none. Everyone had a stake in their own survival, and he had burned every bridge. Then came the investors' statements. Phone calls, letters, urgent inquiries, they were all demanding accountability. The board had no choice but to act swiftly. The CEO, once untouchable, was frozen in the eye of a hurricane he couldn't navigate. Every passing minute brought a new revelation. Another contract gone wrong. Another department mismanaged. Another client threatening to leave. The empire he had built with arrogance and charm was unraveling faster than anyone could intervene. And then the final blow. The auditors concluded with a clear recommendation: immediate restructuring, suspension of executive privileges, and an independent investigation. The board turned to him, expecting a defense. But there was none. The man who had once labeled me intimidating was now speechless, powerless, trapped by the very arrogance that had defined him. His empire was crumbling in real time, and there was no escape. I wasn't there. I didn't need to be. I watched from afar as the collapse unfolded like a slow-motion film. The CEO's name, once synonymous with confidence and control, became synonymous with failure. Employees whispered stories of the empire's mismanagement. Clients left. Partners reevaluated agreements. The board replaced him, freezing his access, and the company entered a period of emergency oversight. I allowed myself a quiet, almost imperceptible smile. Justice had arrived, not through confrontation, not through vengeance in the traditional sense, but through patience, strategy, and the unyielding weight of truth. Every misstep he had taken, every corner he had cut, every inflated claim he had made had come back to claim him, and somewhere, deep inside, I knew he realized the cruel irony. The woman he had feared, the one he called intimidating, had done nothing but document reality. I hadn't orchestrated chaos, I had simply allowed the truth to speak for itself. The company he thought untouchable was now being rebuilt without him. His confidence, once so fierce, was reduced to whispers, regret, and humiliation. And while the world saw a failed CEO, I knew the real story. The collapse was a mirror of his arrogance, a reflection of his disregard for integrity, and a quiet reminder that underestimating someone who sees clearly can be fatal. By the end of that day, everything had changed. The empire he had commanded with fear and charm no longer existed. And I was free, untouched, unshaken, and quietly victorious. In the aftermath, the office felt different, quiet, hollow. Where once there had been a buzz of confident authority, there was now uncertainty and whispered questions. The CEO, stripped of power, retreated into the shadows of his own hubris. His empire, once polished and untouchable, had been reduced to a cautionary tale. I never returned. I didn't need to. The truth had spoken, and it had spoken loudly. Investors were reassessing, employees were adapting, and the board was rebuilding. And though the chaos had consumed him, the company itself began to stabilize under oversight, under scrutiny. And without the man who had once claimed dominance over everyone and everything, for me it was a quiet victory. No celebrations, no confrontations, no dramatic reveals. Just the satisfaction of knowing that patience, diligence, and clarity had accomplished what arrogance could not. I had left a trail of facts, and the empire's collapse followed naturally. It wasn't personal. It was inevitable. Sometimes I think about the day he called me intimidating. At the time, it had felt like a warning, a challenge. Now I see it differently. It was a truth he couldn't accept because he had built his entire world around fear, not reality. And reality, when finally allowed to speak, is unstoppable. Power built on fear is fragile. Confidence without integrity is a house of cards. A CEO thought his charm, his title, and his intimidation made him untouchable, but the truth doesn't bend for arrogance. Sometimes the most devastating consequences come quietly, without confrontation, without drama, simply because reality has a way of catching up. I didn't need to fight. I didn't need to prove anything. I just needed to observe, document, and let the truth unfold. And when it did, it exposed everything he had tried to hide. His empire crumbled, not because of malice, but because deception can never sustain itself. The lesson is simple. Respect, diligence, and truth hold more power than any title, any suit, or any facade. And for those who underestimate the quiet, the competent, the observant, sometimes the fallout is unavoidable, spectacular, and irreversible.